Welcome to the Health Tech Crew podcast, the definitive voice for digital health innovators navigating the intricate landscape of healthcare technology. I'm Igor Gorlatov, partner at Kapla Team, and today we're privileged to have Josh Pappas with us. A seasoned SaaS executive with a remarkable career at the crossroads of healthcare and sales, Josh stands out for his instrumental role in driving the go-to-market strategies of several VC-backed digital health companies. With involvement in firms that have cumulatively raised over $536 million, he's worked hand in hand with industry leaders to accelerate sales revenues and cement new partnerships. Currently, he is making waves at Kintsugi, a pioneering force in mental health care that utilizes voice biomarker software to detect signs of depression and anxiety. Let's dive into his journey in this episode. Hi, Josh. Thank you so much for joining me on the Health Tech Crew podcast today.
Really excited to be a part of it. I always enjoy the work that you've done. So excited to dig in on some of these sales topics.
Sounds good. So you've sold software successfully to large healthcare systems. What's the secret sauce? Can you give us an inside track on what does it take to make it really happen?
Yeah, super passionate about this topic. I've spent my entire career kind of on the intersection of healthcare and sales. Not always software though, and so I'll get to that in a minute because I think that that's important. But I've really just been passionate about how this all intersects with healthcare, software, and specifically on the software side, I think what's been super interesting is coming into these different roles. I'll definitely come at it from a startup lens, which is a whole different world, particularly in healthcare. But what's unique about it is a lot of times some of these emerging technologies, you're kind of going in and you're selling something that up until 2 years ago, 5 years ago, or up until right now hasn't existed before. So for some that's daunting. For me, it's just been an incredible opportunity to get in with a founder, get in with an early product development team, see what they're building, maybe have built, maybe kind of built, and then start to have interactions on how this is going to impact large multi-billion-dollar or single provider practice groups, right? And I think that there's impact inflection points on all of that, right? So I think for me on the sales side, to answer the secret sauce is I'll caveat with this. There really is no secret sauce, right? And it seems cliche, but I think there's a lot of, like with anything, there's a lot of, you go on LinkedIn, here's the 5 tips to do X, Y, and Z. And it's kind of these shortcuts, blueprints, even sales playbooks. I think that a lot of these sales playbooks have now become not obsolete, but they kind of constantly needing refresh, right? We're in an information world. And so you're taking these frameworks that are even, 5 years old, they're probably going to be obsolete if you're taking that exact playbook and trying to do it, right? So I think for me on the sales side, a lot of times there's kind of the 3 buckets that I look at the lens, right? So bucket number 1 is kind of lead generation, right? So if you think about anytime you're selling into any organization, how are you going to get your foot in the door? How are you going to get the conversation started, right? And so in some ways, that's one of the hardest parts to even do. Once you get in there and you can kind of have those conversations. And so I think as you're looking on the enterprise into health systems, it's even harder, right? To use a specific example, right? So other businesses are kind of looking to do business, right? So if you're working in a bank or e-commerce, like business happens. People go out, they eat lunch, they talk business. In healthcare, particularly if you're focusing on provider organizations, they're seeing patients. And typically those organizations are seeing patients 9 to 5. If it's in the inpatient, they're seeing patients 24/7. And I think that that's number 1. I've seen a lot of folks kind of come in thinking that they're going to be able to, fast track it or chat GPT their way into the conversation. And I think number 1, you have to step back and if you're selling to a provider practice, because when I did some of that in the private practice, you got to realize 9 to 5, they're seeing patients. They might have a 45-minute window within their lunch to maybe talk to you, but just know all it takes is waking up in the morning, the EMR is down. All it takes is waking up in the morning, something happens at the practice level. They don't care about your Zoom. Sometimes they don't even care if you bring lunch, and it's not that they don't care. It's just because their patients and their organizations are there, right? And so I think as I transition to the health system, you realize that a lot of the people that you're interacting with aren't necessarily day-to-day heavily involved in that delivery of care. But what they are is they kind of are overseeing a lot of the admin and some of that delivers there. So I think number one, a lot of times from an outreach perspective, there's lots of ways to do outreach. I think there's three main ways that I've seen to kind of get in the door. Number one is email and automation and doing some of those. I don't think it hurts. I think what's happened is now that there's more digital health startups, there's more folks focused on this area. It's becoming harder and harder to do that. But if you are going to do that, I think that, to use a specific example, when I was with Bioformus, we sold a technology that that helped with a new care delivery model with hospital at home, right? Using as an example. And what was unique is that it kind of was created overnight as a response to the pandemic. So there's no playbook on how to sell it because, once we were in it, it kind of was created overnight by Medicare, and it was a great program. But a lot of times I think that if I would have said, gone out and pitched and said, schedule a time with me to demo hospital at home, people wouldn't have responded to that. So what I did and what some of the organizations did is, we educated, right? And so when we did this automated outreach, sometimes everybody says, have a call to action. Well, this call to action actually really wasn't a call to action. It was, let me educate and be a resource, right? Because if you think about it, the conversations that are having on the back end, there's different people in the hospital that overnight their CFOs came to them and said, you are now in charge of hospital at home. So two things. Number one, if I'm looking in all these databases, the Zoom infos, the outreach of the world, nobody's going to show up as coordinator of hospital at home because guess what? They were just anointed that, last week, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. But then number two, what I started to realize is that, these people had internal meetings. They had places and times where they were going to be called upon to basically help guide a multi-billion-dollar healthcare system or organization on a pretty pivotal strategy on, kind of make it or breaking, are we going to do this care delivery model or not, right? CMS had a waiver. Do we want to spend time and energy and resources on delivering this? And so, long story short, I think that we started to set up, again, nothing complex, but we started to set up email cadences where, if nothing else, our main goal was in a, 3 to 6 touch point over, a month or two. Could we arm you with information that you could then take into your own internal organizations and, deliver really actionable, really good information on what were the rules, what were the FAQs, right? And we weren't necessarily recreating this. This is information that exists, but what we were doing is we were bringing it all in one place. We had some work with some of the partners that had already kind of gone through this process, and we're displaying this information to not say, hey, do this, take this information, but you got to talk to me first. We're going to gate it under, all this different areas. And so I think it was the first time I realized that it's a little bit of an information dripping. So some people responded and wanted to have a conversation off a first email. And for some people, it was 6 months later, but they referenced the initial touch point. Hey, I think I saw, you guys sent some stuff on hospital at home. We're finally ready. And so main takeaway there on the front end is there's going to be a lot with ChatGPT that you could probably do. But I think particularly on the enterprise is think about it less as a kind of transactional call to action, and then more of how do we educate with really no intention on, booking something this week, last week. It's really just educating, particularly in healthcare, on the upcoming rules and regulations, the upcoming reimbursement. Maybe you're educating them on something they didn't know. And so I think on the front end, that is important. And then I think being able to leverage relationships to get in the door. But I hesitate on the relationships because I think that the other challenge I've seen, particularly in a startup, right, is you have advisors, you have people within the organization, you have your own leadership. I'm never going to say do not leverage your relationships, but I don't believe that those are a scalable sales strategy, right? Because eventually particularly in health systems, relationships eventually run out, right? And eventually, you can't leverage them. And so I think you have to kind of do those in parallel to, from a starting place to get into the door, because we could talk about having a pretty demo. We can talk about all of the ROI, spreadsheets you have to create once you're in there. But I think a lot of people are struggling right now. And I talk to folks, and particularly if you have, 12 reps when you probably need 2 reps, everybody's going to struggle getting in the door. And the inverse, I mean, as I was at Health, can you imagine if you're a very important person at an important health system or payer or organization? If I'm doing it and I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina, there's probably millions of people trying to get to you. And so imagine just the inbox overload. So sometimes even if I'm doing good content, guess what? Delete, 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 delete. So to me, you're having to hit it at multiple different points and hope that, some of it is just luck, which I know doesn't seem like a secret sauce strategy, but being in the right place at the right time, being in as many conversations as possible, just in those conversations, I think will, to start it, get your foot in the door, which is, from a sales perspective, kind of what triggers everything after that.
So let me summarize kind of what I've heard, because it looks like what you are saying is, number one, some kind of a baseline engagement is through email drip campaigns, where you are not trying to close the deal right away or even get an action from them, but kind of, this is the information you need, these are the changes that are coming your way, be prepared, and we're the nice guys who are providing this information. And that's step one, but we should not count too much on that step, because everyone is doing it. There are so many health tech startups, everyone is overwhelmed. Relationships might be a way to get a little bit further, but they will not help you get over the finish line, because there are so many stakeholders involved. And then there is this challenge that actual decision makers are overwhelmed, and you need to count on serendipitous moments and be at the right place in the right time to make things work. Would this summarize what you shared, or did I miss any specific?
No, I think it's spot on, right? And I think there's a certain level of intention and intellectual curiosity, even as a sales leader, if you want to call it, to really be fascinated with that process of, I mean, I've seen it change. Number one, you have to focus on who you're going after, right? Are you going after provider practice groups? Again, are you going after health systems? Are you going after payers or employers?
So Josh, let's simplify this a little bit. I'll give you a specific scenario, and you just walk me through specific steps.
Gotcha.
So I'm a new startup founder. Like, I've built this beautiful product. I'm ready to pilot it with a health system. I'm the only founder. I don't have a sales team. What should my first 90 days of me deciding, okay, I want a pilot, from a sales strategy perspective, how should I approach it?
Yeah, so number one, I'm always a big proponent of going on a little bit of a listening tour, right? So it's going to be an exciting moment. You as the founder, we figured something out. We have something ready for the world to see. It's almost the opposite of what you think you should do, but a lot of times it's like, who can this benefit? And then also, who can maybe make that decision? And let's cast a wide net. And I wanted to go within those 30 days and have as many conversations, open-ended and also not pitched conversations, but how do I leverage my network, leverage LinkedIn, leverage those different areas to truly go on a listening tour, where set it up, hey, would love to pick your brain, love for feedback around, some of what I'm building, but more focused on listening to you. And then maybe at the last 5 minutes, share, a couple notes on where I think what I'm building is adding value. So I think that there's two things there. People are very busy. So I wouldn't even, although I said it, picking your brain and doing some of those is not necessarily a value add for either person. But I think being able to frame, hey, I would love to spend 30 minutes. The first 20 minutes I would love to spend on you, your challenges, and all of that is really going to be able to help me create my product, enhance my product, whatever else. So being able to set that on the front, I think generally people like to share what they're doing, their day to day, and people are okay with that. And then just say, hey, the last 5 minutes, I'd love to share you 3 bullets on where I think this might, help you in your workflow, and kind of, get some pretty targeted feedback on where I am. So to me, it's you're setting up, you're not asking for an hour, you're not going to go on and on, you're not going to share, hey, I was MD at X, Y, and Z. You can do all that, but I think being able to have that type of conversation. And so what I've seen that unlocks is if you do that in 30 days and you have all those different conversations, I think from there you're going to start to really understand and be able to do some research and then target that. So now you have this wide list. Now I'm going to go to probably 5 systems that have this challenge, and then 5, leaders that I'm going to hopefully be able to, get in front of to be able to say, here are the people that I chatted with, and maybe even if they're okay with references by name.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to conclude this first 30-day model. So what would be a good number of conversations to target? And who are the people I would be talking to? Position-wise.
So I think it depends on, there's lots of different if-thens, right? I think which there's no magic number, right? That's the reality. I think it could be done by, one conversation, but I would say if you think about the target or persona, you really have to get granular on who can make a decision and who am I going to get feedback with. So I think if you can identify on the IT side, for example, the chances of you talking to even 5 CIOs, unless you have a personal relationship where you can pick them up on the phone and call them, and if you can,
awesome.
If you can, don't do what I just described, pick up the phone and call those 5 CIOs, right? But I think you have to be realistic around, if you can have, I would say in a 30-day period, if you can have 2 of those conversations a day, right? That's great.
60 conversations?
Yep, 60 conversations. And then again, take it where you can. Don't necessarily say, oh, I don't want to have conversation with that person, because I think that the perception of multiple different people. So I would say 60 conversations with whatever target organizations that you're trying to do is much better than trying to only talk to one persona, get one, one perspective. So let's say you have those 60 conversations. I think what I would do is really focus
on... again, putting myself, if I haven't sold to a health system, I might know like 5 people in the organization, or like 10 at best. And everyone is busy. And I'm starting day 1. I don't have anything scheduled on my calendar. How do I get from an empty calendar on day 1 to 60 conversations complete on day 30?
Yeah, so I think the front end work is you're going to have to do the hard work of the research, of a lot of the front end of who we need to talk to. There's different databases out there, but I would say Google is a great way. Going on their websites, and then if to fast track it, let's just say you have a network, even a small network. You're coming into healthcare, LinkedIn, and some of the people that don't try to reinvent the wheel. If somebody, it's happened so many times where, I've emailed somebody, and they could be a small, low level or high level. One person intros me to that person, and all of a sudden we have a meeting next week, right? And so I think number 1 from an actionable step is you're not like leveraging your relationship. It's truly opening up. Do you have any relationships with anybody at any sector of it there, and just ask them, say, hey, I'm building something. I think you've seen the power of, if you don't have those immediate personal relationships, get plugged into your local or some of the national different meetups, groups, WeWorks, kind of embed, go to as uncomfortable as it seems, like look up healthcare events near me, right? And go to those, because I guarantee you could maybe have 60 conversations there attending one event, whether it's $29.99 free or $200. It's going to be worth it than spending some of your time on wheels. So I think being creative, being scrappy on that, of having just broader conversations is where I would start. Right.
But for a new person, is like with this pre-work involved, is it like 30 days or it's more like 60 days?
Yeah, I would say
90 days.
or 8 to 10 years, right? I think if you're wanting to do it, in that kind of, nothing's going to happen, particularly in health systems. If you think about, even if you have good relationships, you also have to have and this is important, you have to have a time, expectations, right? People with good relationships, let's say best case scenario, even if they don't have to do all that and have those conversations, you're thinking like 6 to 18 month time horizons to get anything done, right?
Of course.
But what I think you can do is be able to, if you want to accelerate that, then instead of you yourself doing that, that's really where, finding someone who could maybe do that or provide some perspective. Maybe you could have one conversation with somebody who's sold into health systems for the last 10 years, get the same amount of potential information from one person, even if you have to pay that person, than the time, energy, effort of 30, 60, 90 days. I mean, so I think that's number one and a good use of time. What I wouldn't do is use that person, and I've seen it happen a lot of times, and there's definitely a way to do that where you hire a consultant, you hire someone
to sell for you?
Yeah, to get you in that conversation. Because I think what happens is it's like the telephone cup game. You know, you as the founder, you should be able to articulate your vision. And if you bring somebody in, as good as that person's in, they take what you're saying and then they're going to translate it there. And then sometimes it can work out, but usually it doesn't. But if you're going to leverage them on saying, who should I talk to? What persona should I focus on? And then you kind of have a little bit of an idea of what to do, and then that person is impactful. But sometimes I've seen the breakdown of the fool's gold of saying, okay, I can get you, 5 meetings. They're probably taking the meeting because they know that person, and they sometimes don't necessarily care what you as a founder to do, right? And so I think that experiment, be able to identify where you should spend your time, where you should spend, your money that you may or may don't have in your startup, but be able to not replace or outsource at that level if you're really a founder, with having somebody else share your message, because it's probably not going to be as impactful than you.
And I'm sure your message will change as you get feedback. That's what I'm learning as well.
And I think there's power in that. And it's like, it can be frustrating because it's like, well, great, I've had all these different feedback, but it really is helpful to make sure that you're A, on the right track, or B, you need to kind of iterate in real time of your initial idea and be open to that. And then B, I think what you're able to do is the worst byproduct of that is you've now built up your network for this startup, or maybe the next project, or maybe you kind of have a conversation that you realize that somebody else is working on something similar to you. They're maybe far in here on the connection. You have a better product, and so I've never seen it be a downside of having some of those, but I do understand from a timeline perspective, there's also the other side where it's like conversation fatigue and everybody's talking. So I do think that there's a certain time horizon. I don't know exactly when it is, but there's a certain time horizon where you have to kind of translate conversations into some action, right?
So let me recap, because we're covering a lot of things, but I'm trying to make it super useful, like for a founder who is listening to this and who are figuring out this journey. So have those conversations. Don't try to outsource the conversations, but you can leverage someone who has experience in that space to kind of move faster, or have a bit of a shortcut, or be a little bit better prepared for the actual conversation, because you can get a lot from a person who's done it for a long time. But also don't expect miracles, that things will move quickly, because health systems take a long time to get things done.
Yes, I completely agree. The one other interesting entry point, if you're thinking about like raising VC capital as a part of because for some it's not the best idea, right? But if you are, I think what has spawned a little bit overnight, if you're targeting specifically health systems, is a lot of these organizations have kind of built out their venture arm. And so it might not be the best entry point, but particularly if you think you're going to need funding and you have your idea, that's a great way of targeting those folks. And typically,
like enterprise, like Novant Enterprises, or like ATMs,
or all those different ventures. And here's what can happen is they've kind of curated either their investment or their health systems, needs. So number one, you can go to their websites, and you could type in whatever health system ventures. They might or might not have it. They operate differently. But I think where that can kind of help is you fill out a form. So you've already kind of you're in their system. And particularly if they have a need, if you're addressing workforce burnout, and they have listed workforce burnout as one of the areas that they're focused on, doesn't mean you'll get a call back, but you're at least kind of fishing in the waters that are going to be beneficial, right? And that's a great way to start. It's probably an entry point. There's going to be conversations around equity, business model. Maybe you're not there if you're just starting MVP, but to me, those conversations don't hurt, because you can get valuable feedback on the system side, and then also too on the raising capital side, And sometimes that's a good way too of if you're a less mature company, because once you get to a certain funding and rounding, that becomes less. But I have seen it work out well for companies and organizations that started off and could have spent a lot of time, energy, effort trying to get there, and they were able to kind of fast track it within one organization and at least kind of get that support or get some of those thought leaders to be able to do that. So that would be my one. If you're selling specifically to health systems, that probably didn't, it was probably there, but it probably has accelerated pretty significantly in the last 5 years. For some of the health systems looking to kind of diversify their businesses.
But if you're someone like Kepler, right, who is not directly selling to health systems, but selling to organizations that serve health systems, like vendors, providers of software, organizations that need integrations with EHRs who want to avoid this death by 1,000 clicks, and they want to streamline the process and don't necessarily have the capacity to both build the product and build technology. For a company like that, where health system is not the main target, but this is the magnet for your targets, what would be a good strategy in terms of sales?
Yeah, so in my mind, it's actually a more exciting place to be in, because at a certain level, you could just be banging on the health system's doors and nobody answers, right? For months, years, and so that's frustrating value prop. I think, and what you're describing, and taking a step back of healthcare, as you probably know from the software world, everything kind of flows within one ecosystem much cleaner. There's obviously different frustrations and points and entries, whether you're looking at enterprise organizations, but healthcare really isn't there yet to kind of have a continuum, and then people do certain aspects on that continuum, right? You have EMR that's a lot of times a blocker. You have startups that have their own challenges trying to get an entry point. But in the scenario that you described, I think that then it mirrors a little bit more of a traditional kind of SaaS type playbook, right? Where all the things we talked about, maybe I would continue to do around, lead generation, outbound, leveraging your relationships. But there, I think that you're really able to leverage relationships by saying, hey, listen, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but here's how, generate some conversations with some of the folks. I think more people are open to meet for some of those feedback calls, learn about new technology. And usually the pitch to them is much less, hey, we know on the front end of this conversation, you're not going to be utilizing this technology, but I would love for some feedback on how this would make your job easier, or how this would help you with your enterprise customers. So what you're kind of doing is a delicate balance of saying, I know this can make your more valuable relationship with an existing customer, because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to help get them on your side to maybe introduce you, or be in their environment to help service their already customer, right? And so I think that there's two main areas there. Number one, if they have a brand new relationship, let's just say you're trying to get into Atrium Health here, right? And they have just started a relationship or partnership with Atrium Health. They're not going to be a good person to help you get into Atrium Health, because they're trying to kind of selfishly prove their value. If they're a customer for 20 years at Atrium Health, you're trying to get in Atrium Health, you really think you've done your research on the value that the three of you guys could potentially provide, or you could help them with their customer. It's not a sure thing, but I think that that's a much stronger conversation to be able to have. And then sometimes it's just figuring out how much is that relationship worth it to you, worth it to them, worth it to to Atrium, right? And so particularly if you're just a founder, I've seen things more tactically like referral agreements, where you're going to give up. Sometimes maybe it's just for the meeting, right? So you figure out how much would 10 meetings with those organizations be worth a dollar amount, right? Or you can structure it where you can kind of have a percentage of whatever future revenues are, right? And sometimes it's like, hey, if you do something and say, hey, we'll give you 3% of the revenue, and let's just say you sell something for $50,000, it's like, well, is that really worth my time, right? And maybe it is, maybe it's not. And so it's not necessarily clean, but I think that there's an overemphasis on oh, we don't want to give up somebody that much percentage of a revenue. But then I see lots of startups and founders and just in general that then complain because they don't have any revenue. And it's like, well, 0% of zero or 5% of zero is way better, is way worse than, percentage of something, right? Because typically, as you know, once you get into these enterprises, then the fun work starts once you're able to do that. And so I think that leveraging the relationships, if you're trying to either A, get in the door, or B, potentially, co-sell something like that, it's really on the front end making it, worthwhile, or doing some calculations on what it's going to be worth for someone to kind of vouch for you, your organization, your company, and be able to drive value. So it's a tricky situation. I don't think anybody's done it well, but to use an example in the SaaS world, if you look, companies like HubSpot or folks like that, they're greater than half, probably closer to 67% of like their business is channel. Meaning what I just described to you is how a lot of their revenue is generated, which it's somebody has the relationship with a company. You understand that your CRM is a part of an overall whole business ecosystem, and there's different ways to kind of plug into that, and it takes time. But I think that there's I'm hopeful that healthcare kind of gets into a place where it all does kind of flow like that. Because if you can see, you don't have to be everything for everyone, but if you can do a small part of an overall whole, then how do you accelerate some of those conversations?
And just to make sure I understand exactly like the idea and the difference. So first of all, the good news, it's a somewhat simpler process than health systems. And then it's using the similar approach of having conversations, having discovery, not kind of pitching people directly, but trying to get them on your side like you would do with a SaaS product. And then looking for opportunities with folks who already have those relationships that you're seeking and recruiting them and explaining to them where do you fit into the ecosystem so that the overall value created is greater than just them doing the work, or like Atrium leveraging just them.
Yeah,
and then referral agreements, right? Having some compensation mechanism that makes it exciting for people to participate.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes, and I probably do it too, having at least a thesis or an idea of here's tactically how we would do it and how we would help you. Because I think it's sometimes, and not in like a value prop statement or like here's the big challenges with tech right now. It's like, no, like we help with workforce management, we plug into Epic, or we plug into your system and we're going to help these 5 people this way. And when we turn this on, here's how we would pilot. We were able to do this in 3 months doing if you have X, Y, and Z. And so I think being able to get away from the generalities, particularly if you're talking to some of these folks, right? Like I look at myself, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I can help your startup do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes I'm like, but if it's like, we partnered with a Series A startup, we were able to help get their traction to a payer, and the 3-month pilot is going to be able to get you at least conversations with X, Y, and Z. So being able to make it that granular when you're having that conversation, I think is also super helpful to be able to move from, okay, that's great, like let's set up some time, let's send an email, to okay, I have like 5 people in mind where they might go for that.
I love it. Thank you for those specific examples. Let's talk a little bit about you and your career journey. So you're currently at Kintsugi. Can you share the pivotal moments that led you to your current place, and what is Kintsugi and what do you guys do?
Yeah, pivotal moments. I mean, I'm sure you've seen it in your career, but if you were to tell me that I'd be at a Series A mental health software startup, let's just say when I was graduating college, I would tell you, wait a minute, there's something doesn't add up, right? And so I think it's the great journey of life, but I think the 3 pivotal moments that stand out to me, right? So number 1, when I was graduating college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I kind of was involved in athletics, realized I didn't want to do athletics for the rest of my life and professional career, but also didn't necessarily know exactly what I was going to do. And so I got a unique opportunity to kind of get a foot in the door in healthcare, which is some of the hardest ways. And I usually get asked, I didn't have any relationships. I just kind of applied for a lot of different opportunities, and just so happened, got a little bit of luck, and they were looking for a big pharma company, and they were looking for some wild cards that didn't have business experience, that didn't have healthcare experience, and I had no experience.
Not spoiled.
Yeah,
by wrong experience.
Exactly. And so, there's no rhyme or reason other than, just especially now, I think it's gotten even harder. But what that helped me do is, number one, it exposed me to healthcare, and in a way, but it also exposed me to being in and out of a doctor's office, right? I mean, I was a pharma rep, so I got an amazing...
And for what company were you?
I started on a project with Quintiles, which is now Akivia, and Takeda. So a very, Japanese company that's been around, very traditional. So the three main things there is that I got an amazing training program on not only like product training, but just a amazing crash course in how to sell, how to be how to be professional, and we obviously dressed up in suit and ties, which obviously I don't do anymore now, but I think it was super helpful for me, number one. And then I also was a part of a very regional. It was a regional sales job, so I didn't necessarily work from home, but I also didn't go to the office. I got in my Ford Fusion, I drove around, for lack of a better term, in kind of like a little bit of a milk route setting, and I went to the same physician practice offices in the greater Charlotte area, and kind of got a little bit of opportunity to spend time with the staff, the doctors, very quick, and educate them on, it was an antidepressant that we helped launch, and also to a GI drug. So if you can imagine, I talked about depression and the GI tract all day, but what it did, and I had a great team that had been working in the pharma industry for 25 plus years. So I kind of came into a situation that I didn't really know what bad habits were. So I think that's number one. And then looking back, being able to see how a doctor's office runs, from front office to the provider and everything in between, I think is almost invaluable. It's hard to recreate that, but if you're going to sell in health tech, trying to do a version of that type of understanding healthcare from nuts and bolts at that ground level is super important, right? And it's helpful there.
So let me stop you here for a little bit. So if you could condense all those understanding to like 3 bullets that resonated the most, what would those be?
I think the 3 was, there's a lot of amazing people working in the healthcare delivery space, from front office all the way to providers, and understanding their day to day is the number one takeaway if you're going to sell to those folks on being able to do. That's number one. Number 2, understanding the business side of healthcare if you want to sell or I would argue build in healthcare is so important, right? And I had no understanding, appreciation, and it still probably doesn't make sense in certain, because you're doing business in an area that kind of is business, but doesn't want to be business, and sometimes doesn't operate as business. And then number 3, I think the power of mentorship and relationships, and getting out and having those and experiencing those. I mean, those have brought me through different sectors, industries, but healthcare especially, it's table stakes. Like, you have to not only have relationships, you have to have impactful relationships externally and also internally as your professional development.
No, this is awesome. Thank you for sharing. I stopped you from talking from pivotal moments. So I got that you had a great first job out of college, and kind of with a lot of support. But those are big companies. How did you end up in a Series A startup?
A lot of times I knew I wanted to get into software. I was very fortunate to get some opportunities at a very young age. I think right place, right time, performing, developing some of what we talked about. And so there was a pivotal moment where, call it a quarter life crisis, where I was like, why don't I just get out of healthcare and just sell software, right? I talked to my buddies, they're in, cybersecurity, they're doing all this, they're going on these fancy dinners, and, they're just having conversations and, selling software. I didn't really know what software sales was. I'm like, why don't I do that? Why do I keep on, banging my head, talking about CPT codes? And so I went on kind of a little bit of kind of going back to that listening tour, and I started to understand how valuable relationships with these providers that I had, that I kind of took for granted. And I remember I started chatting with folks, founder in New York, Series A company. I didn't even know what Series A meant. All right. I was like, well, it's like I had to look up what VC, Series A, all these acronyms I take for granted now. And what happened was I realized there was so much value in the relationships that I had in people trying to, it was the early stage of selling or delivering software into healthcare, right? There was EMR, but there wasn't like digital health. And so quite honestly, I kind of created a position for myself. Mm-hmm. I was playing kind of matchmaker, consultant, whatever you want to call it, connecting these founders from New York City startups, Seattle, Bay Area startups. And all I was doing is saying, you have this software. I know this doctor in South Carolina that's been having a pain point and challenge around developing this. Like, here's an email. Let's set up a Zoom call right before it was cool to do Zoom calls. Or I think at that time it was actually a cell phone call. Let's do a 3-way cell phone call. And so basically what happened is I joined, I joined Jeff, Jerry, and the founding team at a Series A, a seed stage startup based out of Seattle as their first sales hire. But quite honestly,
what was the name of the startup?
It was Optimize Health.
Okay.
So they were a company, and we kind of all together, I created a job for myself, which is funny looking back, but a lot of times it was, I believed in their mission, kind of being on the front edge of remote monitoring. It was a big challenge. And I would say that's a pivotal moment because that was where I was looking. I would have had to transition and take like 4 or 5 steps back in my career, which sometimes is actually okay if I wanted to get into software and maybe start as a business development rep, do cold calls. And so I was able to, within a niche, kind of put myself into an uncomfortable situation, but at a good time where I was kind of a first sales hire. And I now, would spend that first role selling software to, nationally. So I also wasn't working a small territory anymore, but to a lot of the folks that I knew, physician practices under 25 providers. So basically I was selling into an area where I really knew a lot of the way they worked, their challenges, and this also was a product from product market fit that I felt pretty strongly like would be something that would help them out, right? And so I think that's pivotal moment number 2. Any questions on that?
No.
And then I think pivotal moment number 3 is, okay, you have that entry point. And there's a million different things that I learned. I think I actually remember some of the mistakes I made way more than, some of the highlights. But I think as the 2 ones that stand out is the first time I closed a 6-figure software deal. And I wish it was this LinkedIn story you hear where it's like I woke up in the morning and thought that, it was going to lose the contract signature, but it was pretty mundane. I developed a good relationship with a practice group in Philly. We had a couple conversations. They brought me into their leadership meeting. It all happened just so fast. And, next thing I know is that I didn't complicate it, right? I said, here's what we do. Here's the pricing. They wanted half that pricing. And I went to our CEO. He said, we're not going to do it for half that pricing. And, Jeff would laugh at this day. I came back and they said, we have to make this decision tonight. We need to do it for half this pricing. And I just kind of texted Jeff. I was like, I'm just going to do it. Right. I've been at the company for,
So you overruled the CEO.
I overruled the CEO. And we laugh about it now. But what happened is that they closed the deal. Whatever we thought it was even bigger. And, more importantly, it was right before COVID. So it was a pivotal time. And they wanted to kind of saw the little bit of this. So they wanted to get these remote monitoring devices and software set up because they kind of saw, being up in the Northeast, that things were going bad to worse. They wanted to be able to deliver this type of care to their patients and connect the patients. So long-winded, that story was crazy. But yeah, overrode the CEO, didn't really even know, how to even send the contracting, but, figured out the DocuSign and all of that. And, next thing I know, and in healthcare, it kind of takes a little bit of time, but realized once the dust kind of settled that this was a, 100,000 plus, contract over a year period. And at that point, when you're in pharma and other sales, it's big business, but at a lower level, you're not necessarily having that big of an impact on that business, if that makes sense. Where here, it's they just signed, saying at the minimum, they were going to spend $100,000, for our delivery, right? And we delivered the value on them. So I think that's number 1. And then the only other one is once you go to the enterprise or health systems, I remember my first 7-figure deal. for the first time, which is, doing kind of multi-million dollar in software. And, that one was, I think I counted 45 different back and forth meetings, multiple stakeholders, 10 or 15 times where I'm like, this deal is dead in the water. And you just kind of come out and it's almost at the end. It's not like, yes, let's go celebrate. It's like, I'm so glad that's over. But I think that those are the highlights to feel. And I'll end on, that from a pivotal moment perspective. You can sell other technologies, right? It's gratifying. I don't think anything can really match at various different levels when people are able to sell something, whatever you want to call it, deploy, deliver into healthcare. And at the end of the day, see at whatever spectrum you're able to do, the impact you can have on the patient, which is somebody's life, somebody's family, the clinician, which is somebody that's, overworked, a lot of times underserved, and you just be a kind of a small part of the overall, ecosystem of helping someone and do good. And I think there's multiple other products that do that, but I think healthcare is second to none on, that's what brings a lot of folks back, is once you see that play out from inception to close, and then what it grows to from there. I don't think that you can really beat that, and that's why I'm still here selling in healthcare.
Let me ask you, like you mentioned, two deals, like a 6-figure deal and 7-figure deal. What would you say is the biggest difference in closing the two, and the biggest maybe lesson you learned from the bigger deal?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with having a self-awareness of what product or service you provide, and and where you fit in on that, right? Is like, sometimes it's not necessarily the relationships, it's understanding like, what does your company deliver at a startup perspective? And it's okay with you closing, 25 to 50K of those deals. I think that's one of the things we realized, is that we had conversations in the 100K when we were with Optimize, and we realized we have such a good product that can help providers, and we have been able to do it. So let's continue and do that, and just do that very well, and continue and understand and kind of capture the low-hanging fruit there. We probably could have spent some time, energy, effort chasing that, but our product wasn't ready. If Kaiser Permanente said, hey, you know what, like, Josh, send me the DocuSign and deliver, like, we all were self-aware that, we had 2 developers, like, it would explode, we wouldn't be able to deliver, and you never can kind of get that back. So I think that's number one, is having the conversations, even as the salesperson, because, if somebody said, hey, like, we'll write you $1 million check, like, that could be amazing, but it also couldn't, because as you're building and growing a company substantially, I think that those are the conversations you have to have with leadership, your C-level, investors. Typically, if you're going to take that and set those expectations of like, guys, as much as this logo would look good, we can't deliver. And then product, right? So I think that that's number one. The enterprise is just a delicate balance of a little bit of being at the right place, right time, having a product that's top of mind. The one thing that you can't recreate, and I don't even know how, I think some of this is selection of either a company you're founding or a company you're selling for. You have to kind of be in a top 5 of things of
AI, ChatGPT.
Yeah, so even it's hard there, but if you're doing something that's not on somebody's top 3 initiatives of really the next year, and you join a company, you're sunk, because you're not going to sell anything until minimum 3 years, because people have already made some of their bets. And that's really hard, but I think that there's, and I don't know a great way, I mean, you can, comb through, but I think that that's important, because I knew when I joined the enterprise company, they had a ready built company when I was with Bioformus, but also it was a space that was kind of transcending the provider market. And because of COVID, it was, hospital at home remote monitoring was a part of enterprise health system, was what we were selling to's plans. That doesn't mean that they chose us, but it means that they were probably maybe had some sort of external sense of urgency to choose something, right? Mm-hmm. To do something, right? So once you're fishing in those waters, it's at least hard to do. So I think that's my advice to anybody before you even get there, is you do your homework, research, and figure out, are you even going to be a part of, if you're selling to the enterprise and you're not there, then you're not going to get entry point. And especially now, as health systems don't have any other money. But I think because we were there, because we did some of those awareness, we were treated, and then that sales process is so different. I kind of came into those initial conversations saying, here's the work that we've done. let's map out a 6 to 18 month plan of not me selling you this, of helping you sell this program that doesn't exist now internally. Oh, in addition, where do we impact that? And cross-functionally, what you're doing is you're taking your clinical team, your business team, and your product team, and everybody's kind of embarking on a journey that you hope ends with them making a decision, obviously purchasing your software, but you're kind of doing it in a way where you're trying to match up these teams, cross-functionally, getting on people's calendars, to be able to. The way I look at it is, if you have kind of a true enterprise sale, you're never going to have 100 conversations going on at the same time, right? In fact, if you have that and you're really trying to sell to health systems and you have a list where you're like, let's get 50, health systems in our pipeline with a couple of people, like, you're going to fail. What you need to do is really focus on, okay, you're going to have 10 or 15, you're going to have 5 that maybe get it to this level. And then ultimately you kind of want to have 2 or 3 that are going to make a decision in whatever time frame you need to kind of have, whatever time horizon. And you just hope to kind of be in that contracting phase, or they're going to make a decision, because believe it or not, of those 5, sometimes only 2 of the 5 might even make a decision to go with any vendor, which is crazy because you've done all that work, all that prep work, and it's also frustrating for them. So think about the other side. It's frustrating.
All those teams
have done all that time, energy, effort, and that's something I'm not going to fix, right? But to me, it's so frustrating for them because we've done all this work, and sometimes it's not like, Josh, we went with another vendor. It's like, Josh, we're not doing that anymore. So I think being able to be a part of that, and ultimately, I think at the end of the day, there's no magic. There's a lot of mistakes you can make. There's a lot of blind spots. I think even for me, thinking that it's done before you literally get the signature. And it's not like, oh, I think that that's done. It's just you look back and you're like, oh, I should have done this or that, because there is a new CEO could come in and all this work you've done for 18 months in a health system sale or enterprise sale could just go away overnight. And it's just scary. And I think also too, as a seller or an organization, you have to get folks that doesn't make them squeamish, right? And from a professional perspective and livelihood perspective, it's not for everyone, but you have to be able to kind of have that high risk, high reward, but you also have to have somebody who can kind of manage expectations internally and externally. And I think that once that contract signature gets done, you don't even sometimes believe the dollars amounts associated with it. Again, you're kind of on to the next challenge of being able to help some of those folks.
Tell me a little bit this last step, right? From there was this Optimize Health startup, and then what was next, and how you ended up at Kintsugi.
Yeah, so I think I kind of entered into this, VC backs, a venture capital backed startup world, right? And so where I entered it is being among or the first sales hire, where, if you can imagine, it seems crazy, but imagine a world where you might have some closed deals or sales, you might have 5 or 10, or you might not have any at all. And so I've done all of those different stages. And from a venture capital perspective, where it comes in is, when I was with Optimize, we went seed to Series A. So we went from kind of, as close as you could get to developers or folks, in a garage, to like, we made it. This is our first, first check, to, when I was with some of the later startups, the last couple, it's more, they were well funded, but still operated in a very much of a startup. And it was kind of a different problem where it was hyper growth, right? Where you now had an idea, you had a foundation, you maybe had some really good customers, and the rest of it was spent kind of, how do you build, scale, sell yesterday, right? Fast, with more people, with more headcount. And so a lot of times I'm glad it happened that way. And the products we were selling was very end to end, right? So meaning we interfaced on the front end with patients, whether there was RPM devices or apps. We figured out how that flowed into their clinical workflows, how that stuff was going to get to the EMR, to then ultimately get to the clinician, and then it was kind of a full circle. So that's very hard because you're
Could you give some names, because just to figure out the journey?
Yeah. So it was with Optimize, their first sales hire. I transitioned to Bioformus, which was a unicorn in the similar space, but for me professionally, I wanted to go from provider practice to enterprise. So then I was there in the enterprise, transitioned to the patient experience space with Tendo, and then realized after, which doesn't seem that long, but realized after about 5-6 years, kind of post COVID, that I was a little burnt out selling just to health systems exclusively, right? And I think everybody's read the news. It's a tough. The whole healthcare ecosystem has changed pretty rapidly with embracing digital technologies, but health systems especially have kind of been interrupted from the Amazons or so of the world. These kind of payers that are kind of becoming payviders, and I think the most frustrating conversations was all this amazing work that we were doing, that these teams were doing, but as the kind of finances, the show me the money aspect of this, health systems just went from kind of all the challenges we talked about to worse, where it's like they're not making any purchasing decisions. They're kind of getting rid of innovation teams, and so I saw a little bit of the writing on the wall. Epic says that they can do everything, right? And so I think for me, I took a step back and realized, all right, I enjoy being in the startup. I enjoy being in the health tech space. So how do I take some of the learnings and maybe embark on a new challenge? And so that's when I kind of, was able to really assess everything that you and I just chatted about. So assess lots of different companies. And in that journey, what I did is I had relationships, conversations, folks with different, startups and other sectors of healthcare and outside of healthcare. I also talked to and worked with a lot of founders, right? So imagine, I think it's good tactically, like imagine people hit you up on LinkedIn, or you reach out to them. Sometimes it's like, man, my day is so busy. I don't want to spend who's this random person from, X, Y, and Z. And what I did was, even prior to that, is I tried to carve out my schedule to have, 5 to 10 of those conversations a week. Not necessarily saying, here's the agenda, here's this or that. It's literally just, who are you? Okay, here's a little bit of who I am. Like, what are you working on? And there was no other, it wasn't like, hey, let me charge you $200 for my time for you to do that. It was literally just have those conversations. So I did all that in the front end. So I think what happened is that once I was kind of looking and in the market, I felt pretty good about then re-tapping into that network, because I didn't necessarily need anything, because I was building these relationships off of not just like, hey, all of a sudden I'm looking for a job, like who can help me? It was really just, hey, I know we've chatted about all the cool things you're doing. Do you know anybody hiring? Who are cool companies? And then once I started to get a short list of those companies, I then actually was able to say, hey, these are the kind of 3 companies. You're a leader of payer. You're a leader of a telehealth company. Like, would you buy this? What are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on this sector? And I think people don't have to be well connected to do that, but I think you have to kind of get out of your own head to be able to have some of those conversations. So that's when I did that. And then I realized, all right, I want to potentially be a part of, selling more into kind of the health plans and payers, but also I'd love a technology where I could sell into an area I'm passionate about, which is like other digital health and telehealth companies, right? I wasn't necessarily locked in on a sector of healthcare, because I think I've seen as a early sales, some of what I enjoy doing is have a product obviously that works, but I was more kind of interested in the process around Series A type companies. So still early, but enough funding where we're gonna have health insurance and all this crazy stuff like that. And honestly, a little bit of luck, right? Or a little bit of, call it serendipitous timing. And I went to a wedding in Greece this summer and came back and spent July on this area. So call it, I was maybe okay with going and being a lemon farmer, as I came back from Italy and Greece, right? You have a different mindset once you travel and do that. And there was a recruiter that talked to me initially before I left, and I kind of didn't even, left it on red, and kind of, went on this embarking journey and realized, all right, Kintsugi, this is a great role, great company, and kind of into the mental health tech. And so that's, I joined as their kind of, leader of sales. But right now it's a sales team of 1, small commercial team, but I knew what I was, signing up for. And I think it's been I'm excited to kind of get them to the next level, and then kind of building out a team of my own, because I think I was super okay with being kind of an IC or an individual contributor and kind of helping as our company grew. But I didn't, at that time in my career with the other roles, I didn't want to be the manager or be the leader, where now I think that I've seen and I've learned, and I kind of am okay with still getting my hands dirty and doing all the nitty-gritty needed, but having the frame of reference of, okay, what am I doing today that helps maybe the team I'm going to try to build in 6 to 12 months.
Very cool. Could you give us like a very condensed explanation of the value proposition of Kintsugi? What's the pain that you are solving for?
Yeah, so Kintsugi's, as we talked about, a Japanese origin, kind of repairing pottery with gold, right? And more specifically, it's a mental health focused startup. It's also an AI and voice startup, which we'll get to. But taking a step back, one of the areas it's really focused is there's no great way to objectively measure mental health. And as you can imagine, coming from my past life, we had devices that measure hypertension, and we know there's a correlation between certain physical diseases, tracking, measure that daily, monthly, and that doesn't really exist today. And because of the pandemic and because of some of the areas, what also we started realizing is that there's a huge connection between mental health and physical health. But then particularly a lot of these value-based organizations are realizing there's a financial impact on not addressing mental health. So those are kind of some of the broader themes. Where we're focused on is how do we help enhance current, screening for mental health? How do you help folks, have an initial conversation about mental health, but then also too, how do you kind of track that over time? And so what Kintsugi built with our own founders, Grace, they had their own struggles with mental health. I think we all have. I know I have. My mom was a therapist, so there was a lot of talk about mental health. But then two brothers, there's not really a lot of talk growing up. But I think through the pandemic and just through some certain burnouts professionally, you have your own personal. Everybody has a unique connection to mental health. But what the technology is able to do is pretty fascinating, where it's able to use. There's always been a connection from voice and mental health, but the power of AI and some of what they were able to do, attacking it from a kind of machine learning and AI perspective, is draw an understanding or correlation between signal processing and the voice to be able to identify and kind of sift through some of these areas to identify, and then also to kind of risk stratify patients. And so Kintsugi, our solution is able to take, screen for clinical depression and anxiety using purely free-form speech. And we kind of have an AI model that's able to take that speech and be able to produce, not only depressed or not depressed, but kind of a low, moderate, or severe depression severity, purely off of some signal processing on the voice.
And you mentioned that your focus right now is the payer market, correct?
Yeah, so if you think about a focus marker, take even a step back, right? A lot of folks now are realizing, and they've made investments in understanding that, hey, diabetes is 5x more expensive if you're diabetes and depression, right? Cardiovascular is twice as expensive, and so there's the connection understanding there. And then as you're moving to value-based care, it used to, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think sometimes in a fee-for-service, finding more mental health or depression patients, there obviously were addressed, but it was kind of like, oh no, we're creating more, more chaos and problems because we have a shortage of number of providers. But as things have gone to value-based care, but particularly payers, when they're really concerned with managing the total cost of care and understanding the connection with mental health, anybody who kind of understands that connection and from a financial or clinical perspective, they're our customer, right? Now, more tactically, what's happened is the payers are kind of leading the way on that overall cost of care. So yeah, from an enterprise perspective, we can bucket it into payers, value-based care, providers of care, people who are delivering services or care, and obviously think like the Blue Crosses of the world, the Uniteds of the world. They could be potential customers from the solution. Now, what's unique about the solution is, as we've talked about a little bit today, a lot of it's not a patient app. What it is actually an API-based solution. So for the folks, including myself, before I got to the software world, a great way to think about it is, if you've used on a sales lens, Salesforce, right? Everything with underlying Salesforce infrastructure can kind of be plugged and played. So you have APIs, you can use, certain tools that as a part of a whole. So what our solution allows us to do is we can plug into really anywhere where audio is being streamed currently, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. You've probably called in if you've ever scheduled a healthcare appointment, or if you have a certain healthcare provider, somebody or loved one might have outbounded to you, either checking on your appointment, checking on your status of care. And so you kind of have, or just in general in your personal life, you have these call centers that exist. And in healthcare, they've become more and more increasing because you want to be able to focus on certain populations. And so you have these call center environments that people utilize. So one of the areas where we can plug in our technology is we're kind of running in the background. We gather consent. So patient consent's an important component of this, right? So folks, know this happen, but consent can happen in healthcare lots of different ways, but that's step one. But then what we were able to do is kind of analyze and listen in to this conversation, take some of the audio, and then be able to, in real time, produce a risk stratification on the status of that patient's depression, for example, right? And so it's low, moderate, or severe. So that's one example. Think about a virtual visit. Everybody, I think, can relate and has done a version of a virtual visit, whether it's mental health focused or whether it's just in general, seeing your primary care, seeing your provider for a cough. But the same can apply there. Because it's an API, because it's able to plug into these environments, one of our customer points can be anybody who delivers virtual telehealth care, right? So that's a lot of people. It's a small company all the way up to large telehealth providers, but then those telehealth providers or small companies are typically servicing a health system or provider. So we're able to plug in, and what we're doing is similar idea is we're taking some of the voice. We can do it as little as 30 or 40 seconds, and what the AI is able to do, so going back to what AI can do well, pattern recognition. They're looking at millisecond level changes, not in, hey, Igor is having a bad day today. What it's actually able to look for is deeper than that. It's some chronic voice processing that shows and can get out, and it's been validated that you might be depressed, right? And so our models compared to what currently exists now, and maybe we should start there, where you go to the doctor's office and you're asked a series of questions for anxiety or depression. Maybe you're not asked, right? And so right now there's not a great way, but it's paper and pencil. It's very subjective, and so we're not meaning to replace that right now. What we're meaning to do is, if you think about the workflow, asking a set of questions is sometimes intrusive. Sometimes the providers don't have time. What if we could have something that's kind of embedded into these different care deliveries? Hey, all this stuff exists. So Josh isn't saying, hey, you know what? You need to invest in all this video equipment to be able to do that. Then we can plug it in there. It's where can we take some of these points that are able to do that? How do we very low, and from an API perspective, how do we layer this into, and being kind of a portion of a whole, and make it a better way to screen for some of these folks, and quite honestly, potentially have a more objective way to initially measure and find some folks, but then also to be able to bucket folks low, moderate, or severe, so stratify them so that from a payer perspective, they have a lot of these resources sometimes, right? And so what they do though is that if somebody's just depressed or not depressed, you're probably not going to get a personalized resource. So that's kind of some of what we're doing on the tech side, on the clinical side, and in some of those areas at Kintsugi. But it's really exciting because I have a lot of conversations with a lot of folks in healthcare, not in healthcare. I think everybody can agree, whether it's solely us doing it, it's definitely an area that needs focus, and it's definitely an area that if we can add some layer of being able to help more patients get the right treatment in mental health, then that's a great problem to try to be solving.
Very cool. So I want to move away a little bit from like nuances of the business and just talk about the day in your life selling this software. What does it look like, a day or a typical week?
Typical day and week. I think that's probably the hardest part for somebody who is maybe used to selling not in a startup that then comes into, I would say, an earlier stage startup. the time management and the day to day is probably the hardest part. And I don't know if I have it, 100% figured out, right? But I'll give you some scenarios.
Sure.
I think the more times where I look at my calendar and I'm chatting with external, either customers I've chatted with, initial conversations, or partners as a part of the ecosystem, those are the days that I get excited to get
Sure,
out.
but I want to focus, like, let's take this week.
Yeah.
So if we took 100% of the time, and today is Friday, so like 4 days, so 4.5 days, what were the items, so the buckets, and could you talk a little bit about each? Like about this particular week?
Yeah, this particular week.
Yes.
So this week's been a whirlwind, right? Because I woke up and at 6 a.m., took a flight to New York to meet with our small but mighty commercial team, right? Myself and my 3 other amazing partners teams at the marketing, right? And so what we did is I had 2 customer-facing initial demo calls when I sat there. And then for a 4-hour period, we met as a team to be able to plan our 2024 goals and initiatives, right? And then the next day I woke up and I had 4 in-person meetings with just digital health leaders in New York, as we talked about the chaos in New York. So I went from WeWork to WeWork. And then I had about 4 virtual calls with partners that we've had an initial demo conversation with, and or we met out at the Health Tech Conference, and we had what I would call like a demo and scoping call. So they agreed that what we were doing could be of interest to them, right? And you had a big enterprise payer organization, and then you had a couple different virtual care organizations where this would be a small part of what they deliver. And those conversations, 30 minutes to an hour, there's some common themes with those, but sometimes there's not. I went to a healthcare happy hour that I didn't kind of want to go to from 6 to 8 in New York, going from Times Square to Brooklyn, but there was a key person that I wanted to meet there face to face that had invited me to it. And I got there and I would say met 4 or 5 folks where shared a little bit about what they were doing. I shared about what I'm doing. And 2 of those conversations now yielded some of those meetings. Got on a plane, 6 a.m. on Monday, on Wednesday, got back to Charlotte. And, I have certain areas of my day where I carve out for what I would call, pipeline generation and prospecting, right? So they're dedicated kind of time blocks where, although we have a lot of great, conversations and enterprise and partners, maybe it's just because I've done it and built it from scratch. Like, you have to have dedicated time, in my opinion, to be able to craft messaging. Luckily, there's automation tools, so you can kind of run these lists of folks, companies, titles, personas that you want to get in front of, but you have to spend dedicated time like actually doing that. And so for me, it's 2-3 hour sprints where I focus on either crafting that message or automating the workflow to send it out. Now, once you send it, it can be automated. So you kind of have embarked on that, checking up with LinkedIn and following up from conferences. And so I dedicate time to that, because the problem I've seen is that if you don't dedicate time to that and you just do it sporadically, you don't do a good job of it, or you're not going to, really focus on getting the best time there. So think about those time slots. And then I think the back end of that, 20 to 30% is some of the internal meetings that are important from alignment. Some of, as a sales leader, what I have to do is probably within I've been at the new role for 3 months, which feels like 2 years at this point in startup years. But some of it is redefining and updating, Salesforce, which is kind of, our source of truth. I could be doing all of this, but from an internal or an investor perspective, a lot of time is spent understanding what has and then trying to help add of what is, so that we're talking about deals. When I talk to Igor about, or other people within the organization about things that are late stage and are probably going to close, we need to have whether they come from sales or not, we want to have an understanding and a tracking of how much are those worth, why are they going to close, have we talked to the right people, all the way to initial conversation. And so some of that time is not the most fun time, but being able to spend that there. And then I would say, the third one, or the last one that's really important to me, is I got to carve out time for what I would call exercise, competition, and so sometimes those are the evenings or early in the mornings.
And what competitions?
Right, competition. So competitions are just more working out, playing. For me, I can do workouts. I go to workout classes, and I think that's a physical one. But I also still, as a former athlete, I think I like the competitive nature of sales, but also, so I'm not a crazy person to my fiance and family back at home. I have to also get out of the house, because all of this happens, except for, when I'm doing that traveling, all of this happens within the confines of your little home office, right? So I have to get out of the home office. I have to go play basketball or pickleball, or sometimes it's golf. And, for me, that's a physical activity. But other than that, it's also like a, mental competition that I can go out there and, it's not like I'm out there throwing elbows or anything like that. But it's really helpful for me to, level set, to get some of that, aggression, whatever you want to call it, out. And some of my best, I would say, ideas sometimes come from exiting myself from that home office, getting in there, not like overemphasizing or thinking about a certain deal or a certain challenge we have internally, but just thinking more broadly, like, what could I do? What's a unique person I can connect with? And then coming back, implementing some of those. And then Friday hits and it's like, wow, this has all happened in 1 week, right? And that's not necessarily for everyone. I think as I have weekly plans, I have monthly plans, but then the reality of a startup is I could get to next week, and although I have some plans that won't change, I have to be okay with, we could have a certain initiative that change on a dime, and we got to go into that week, and 30% of my week that I thought was going to be planned is a completely different plan. And so for some, people think that they want to work for a startup, but I'm also creating and retracing the steps. I think those are the two other areas from a startup perspective that I've seen, and I still probably don't do the best job of it, but you really have to want to build from scratch and create. I think a lot of people like to build upon still what exists, right? Creating slides when there's a slide deck template already there, but do you want to work for a startup where you might be creating the actual slide deck? You might be creating the template. And I think I've seen some people, like, create is a subjective word, create or build, because typically people don't, what do you mean it doesn't exist? So that's number one. And then I think number two is being able to also, I think about certain things that Josh, Igor are going to do within the confines of whatever role that you're doing, right? So from a sales perspective, there's certain relationships I have, that our board has, that our CEO has, and let's build those up. But I also am hyper-focused on all of this work that I'm doing. It's almost an extra step, but I have to A, retrace it somewhere, and then B, also retrace what's scalable and what's going to work. So what's going to work when it's not Josh? It's a team of 4 business development reps. It's somebody who has similar experience with me, but can take what I'm doing and take the things that are scalable, so that when we have 4 sales reps, 10 sales reps. So that's the other challenge too, is like some people, and I was probably guilty of it before I was all of these roles, they want to sell, they want to understand how to sell it, what we're selling, and then they can embrace the nuances there. But as an early stage salesperson, you have to kind of build some of those, scalable either processes or, things that work and don't work, and quickly measure and quickly, trash them, right? I might think that this is going to work, and you iterate that when you go from 10 customers. It probably is going to be some of the similar things, but it's going to be different when you're 50 million in revenue, and probably different when you're 50 million to 100 million and so on there. I've seen some folks just kind of keep that same framework and then just try to like take the framework as you go there and not adjust at all. So that's a day in the life, and then life doesn't slow down too, right? So, getting ready to close on a house, and imagine all the documents and, that goes with
Congratulations.
that. Congratulations. So all that happens. And I think that if you're looking for a lot of variability, that's good. But I think also too, the scariest part is you could almost have too much variability, and you can also almost have, for early stage career folks, I go back and forth on really thinking, is it best to start in a startup as your first role? And I think the jury's out. My own personal opinion depends on the person, like with a lot of things, but I am glad that I had the trajectory the way that we described it, because I had some sort of foundation of how a doctor's office ran. I had some foundation of how to be an adult business, whatever you want to call it, and the training program, and then you could kind of go different ways, right? But getting in a startup where sometimes it can be too much chaos, but also too you could be doing things because yeah, you're learning, but you're also just learning bad habits, which sometimes is the worst. But that's a maybe topic for another day.
So you were at a startup. You have to figure out sometimes doing things for the first time, also like leaving steps behind what has been done. What are the key performance indicators you're using for yourself and you would recommend for the first sales hire to use at the Series A startup or even seed stage startup?
Yeah, no. So I think the number one advice I'd give is have tough conversations in alignment with different, number one, your CEO team, if you've taken board money and investors, and making sure that you understand what's been discussed, around those metrics to begin with, even before you come. And great if you're a part of those conversations, even better if you can have those conversations kind of with your CEO, founders, board, investors, whatever else.
The idea is that you're not coming in and there are some commitments that are unrealistic.
Well, I think two things can happen, right? Yes, that would be ideal state, right? But sometimes in the reality of different roles as company grows, if depending on different stages, sometimes those conversations have quite frankly already happened or already been committed. And so what you can do, and I think it's really important in healthcare, is understand that and not be dismissive of that, not just say, oh, this is unrealistic. Oh, it's really understand, how did we come to this? What about any sort of past engagements, conversations, customers, like what kind of predicted this, and is it somewhat linear, and it's okay if it doesn't. But then also too, I think go in and evaluate some of what you have. Do you have 2 customers? Do you have 0 customers? Do you have 10 customers? And so in healthcare, some of the metrics, and so there's going to be metrics and a lot of acronyms around ARR, annual recurring revenue. Sometimes it's really hard to do things like from a marketing perspective on conversion rate, or how many inbound leads are we getting. I mean, all those are somewhat important, but there's annual recurring revenue. At the end of the day, revenue is the most important part of the sales leader, the operation. That's like just straightforward. But in healthcare, and especially at a C to kind of before Series B stage, there's a lot of metrics that have to be executed on that sometimes don't involve dollars and cents, right? So a couple examples of that. Whatever tool that you're doing, sometimes it could be, how many, contracts or logos, or what type of people are we signing, right? And so that could be an important metric, and it's twofold, right? In healthcare, as folks that have been in the healthcare know, if you're selling an enterprise, let's just say, there's a lot of, it's kind of like chicken and the egg. There's a lot of, oh, who have you sold to? What are some of those logos? And if you don't have those, you're not going to get in the door. But how do you get in the door if you don't have those?
Let me kind of streamline a little bit your answer. Like, could you talk, like, first of all, what's the number of metrics that is good to have for a salesperson to focus? Is it like 100, or is it like 1 or 2?
Yeah.
And then could you share the metrics that are being used for you specifically?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a big believer of there's no magic number, but I think that the 5 most important metrics, for me are, number of deals signed, no matter the size, patients or members under contract, right? So to get to that one, it would be, if we do a deal with, some organization, how many kind of patients or members do we have for our technology, right? And so if
as part of a health plan, for example.
As part of a health plan, right? It could be 14 million. If we do it with a virtual care, maybe they only have 40,000. And so that's an important metric.
Okay.
And the other one that's important for us more downstream is what is our API utilization, right? So from that, we're going to be able to, it's kind of a front-end sales metric, but sometimes it teeters on, it teeters on like a customer success or delivery metric, but I think it's important, right? Because that's where you see how much is this being utilized.
Have you sold to the right organization that will actually use it?
Yeah. So, and sometimes it's like you frame up, okay, obviously if we have 15 million people and only, 5 people are utilizing the API, we have more to chase, but like what's going on there? That shouldn't be that, that percentage. But I think also too, some of the other metrics that are in your control is what's the kind of speed to close, right? So enterprise, or let's call it mid-market, small, medium markets.
What are good numbers there?
When you had an initial conversation to when someone signs a deal, what is that time frame?
What's a good number?
It depends, right? But one of the things you have to do is you also have to get a sample size of, in my opinion, at least 2 enterprise customers.
That closed with this
That
product.
have closed something, that have signed a deal that's saying they are going to use your product or service. It could be for $0, because this is the other crazy thing about healthcare. I could go to you, Igor, CEO of hospital system in Charlotte, North Carolina, and say, do this. You can do it for free. And guess what? It's still going to take 6 to 10 months for them to sign a free deal. So yeah, signed agreement to do work, whatever, work for us. It's like API usage work. And then in the mid-market, I would say like a 5 to 10 is normally, if it's like an under $50,000, under $100,000 deal, that's normally a good sample size to be able to at least have enough sample size to start to understand these metrics, right? We can still track some of those, but once I understand that, then we have a good enough sample size of how many patients under contract are in those 2, how in the small. What's the time to close those deals? So it could be, in using a real example, it could be less than 30 days, for the mid-market folks, or it could be, typically it's less than 6 months is what's going to happen. But understanding those, it could be realistic and set expectations. If it takes, for $50,000 deals, if it takes more than a year to close that, I would argue
$50,000 deal, more than a year.
Yeah, more than a year. If it does, I would argue probably juice isn't worth the squeeze, or why is it taking so long? Maybe there's some things the sales are doing. So to me, it's mapping it back to the platform, some of those, and then I think at the end of the day, what are the behaviors of some of what I'm happening? Like, what are the behaviors that get us to that end goal of revenue, of some of those different metrics that we're able to do? And so I think that what I've seen is, and everybody has to agree. I could understand and think that those metrics are important, but I have to lay those out to internal commercial folks, leadership, and then investors. And then I would say you can kind of come to 5 metrics that are non-revenue, maybe some of the more 2 to 5 business metrics. Once we have those, we also say a time horizon, right? Are these short-term and long-term? So short-term could be, let's just say quarter to quarter, or now into the end of the year. Here's some metrics or goals that I mentioned that we have to get to. And then taking a step back, what are our 12-month and then further 36 months? And those could change, but we have to kind of be mapping short-term behaviors to lead to those long-term goals.
Let me clarify, because the parameters that you mentioned, they are more like lagging indicators. Mm-hmm. Are there any goals that track activities? Like, for example, the number of meetings, the size of the pipeline, the stage of the pipeline, readiness, any of those things? Do you feel they are important, or they are not that relevant?
I think they're important. I think can be, and this is just my personal opinion, I think sometimes there's and that's just the way of the world. I think it's not going to change, but I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on that when you have a sample size of, small sample size. So I think they're important to think about how many meetings do we need to get those. But if we're just tracking the number of meetings and nothing's closed, how do I know if it's not going to take meetings until the end of time? Does that mean go out and don't get meetings? No. Does that mean if you are building out a BDR or a sales team to have like meetings as a metric or activities as a metric? I think what's important early stage is you can't take a framework for a company that's done something and just say, hey, a company that has 10 million in revenue, here's what they use. Here's a framework for what they used on number of activities, number of meetings. Because sometimes what you can do is you don't think about some of those lagging indicators. So to me, you can outline those, but be able to iterate on actually mapping out, we did 4 meetings to close this deal. So let's maybe start with some of some of those. And so I think activity is always interesting because now with the advent of ChatGPT or emails, number of calls made, some of the more, I would say, basic outreach conversations and activities, I think we need to track them, but I don't have as much faith in those as great indicators for whether you're going to get deals closed or not.
Sure, but just coming back where I'm coming from, right? You said 3 months in a job, or maybe like 6 months in a job, right? As a founder, I hired that person. Mm-hmm. How do I know? And maybe the deal, like enterprise deal, will take a year, or you mentioned like 18 months. How do I know, like week to week, that my sales team is on target, below target, any tweaks are needed? So what's your guidance there?
Yeah, so my guidance is if you're really swimming in the enterprise waters, it's a scary place to be because what you just described is I don't know if you're going to know, right? And so what I think is helpful is making sure that week to week we're communicating. You as a founder, it can be a conversation, but we set 3 or 4 metrics that we're checking in on and making sure that we're tracking to that. But that's the challenge with enterprise, right? Is that it's not a week to week. There's zero way, and this is going to be controversial, but there's zero way to know week to week if an enterprise deal is going to be at close. Now, what we can do is we can take, if we've seen it done before, then we can map some of those different areas. But I think that's really where there's reporting tools out of Salesforce, it's activities, it's trust. But I would say if you're looking at enterprise, month to month is a better time horizon. And even that can be can be very challenging because months can go by, weeks can go by. There's no sense of urgency to buy. And so you can always it's always good to have 3-4x of pipeline, whatever your deal size is in the various different, later stages. So there's ways I think that you can figure out week to week. But I think I've seen the inverse of that happen, Igor, is where founders want like a weekly summary. What's the status? What are the conversations? And I think also the inverse can happen is you can, make some rash decisions by over-indexing on activities that happen week to week, right? Like to use a good example is it can take for an enterprise conversation, let's just say with a health plan. I mean, it could take 4 to 6 weeks to coordinate with an EA to get a meeting that's an important meeting. They obviously know it's an important meeting on someone's calendar with an important C-suite executive. So what do you put in that weekly report? We got a meeting set up in 4 to 6 weeks, right? And yes, we can do all this prep work or this or that, but like nobody can do anything to get that meeting accelerated. Now, when we get to that meeting, we got to do all that. And I think the main theme is that do you as a company have to sell to the enterprise, right? That's more of an important. Are there ways that we can either maybe it's not a big enough dollar amount, but and sometimes the answer is no, right? Like I've been with companies that their whole business and operations and software is built for the enterprise. So that's great.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you sharing this, and I wanted to push on this because this is the question that a lot of founders face in terms of okay, how do we measure, how do we track? And I think we didn't necessarily get to a specific answer, but you shared your thinking around this, and this is super helpful. I wanted to switch gears and ask, what's the book that you're reading, or the book that impressed you the most that you read recently?
Yeah, recently I think it's Think Again by Adam Grant, and it was just fascinating to just kind of turn on your head. That's the new book that I read. Just turn on your head on not going into conversations and really kind of rewiring your ability to kind of rethink. And so for me, being in salesperson, there's a lot of kind of confirmation, getting people to not necessarily think the way I think, right, but understand that they have a problem, help solve those problems. But within that, and I just think from a personal perspective, there's not a lot of time, energy, focus on getting, having an open mind and even going to a sales call and just literally being able to rethink in real time, right? Be able to understand and truly coming out of open mind and the power of that to getting to the decision you want to do. So I think that's the number one. The number two, and is, kind of the book around, negotiating. I don't know if you've read it by one of the Harvard. Well, he used to actually be a impressive terrorist negotiator, FBI negotiator. Went back to Harvard, and that's one that I probably reference and go back to and read weekly. And that's where I've just seen my own personal ways of consuming mediums of books. I like to reread and reapply. So instead of reading all these books, I like to go back and say, okay, are there certain books that I've read that I can, apply in the next, not week, in the next coming months, apply some of the concepts to prospecting, to negotiation. Sometimes not even in my professional life. Sometimes in my personal life, I'm like, wow, if I use this technique, maybe I wouldn't be in the doghouse, at home, right? And then I'd say the third bucket isn't really reading, but I love podcasts. I love podcasts that get my mind away from sales. But there's a couple, 30 Minutes to President's Club, and there's a couple that I'm happy to share with you some of the links that sometimes are sales focused but aren't healthcare sales focused. So what it allows me to do is sometimes, Igor, when you and I are banging our head on all the challenges we've talked about on breaking in, selling into healthcare, it's nice to have perspective of saying there are folks in other industries that sometimes do things and do techniques and try this out. And sometimes it's not going to work in healthcare because you're selling B2B software, but sometimes it can. And it's nice to be able to get some of those perspectives and, some of those short kind of 30-minute audios. And then sometimes they're more long form, are the way that I've seen to be able to kind of consume. And it's weird that I enjoy that, right? Like, it's like weirdly calming if I'm on a walk and they're talking about some of the metrics we're talking about, or like a sales tool, and I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I just tried that, that AI sales tool to help automate my note taking, and it's always weird. And then when you're sitting at the airport, it's so amazing how like you start talking about either healthcare or sales and how you can strike up a conversation and kind of nerd out on some of those topics.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing those examples. And my last question would be, what advice would you give to someone who is just considering getting started in healthcare sales or health tech, like digital?
Digital health, yeah. And I think that's number one. Like, what is it going to become, right? So I think there's the biggest advice I can give is, network. But even if you're an introvert, have conversations with as many folks that are at various different levels of where you're trying to go, right? And the reason why is I think that there's some folks that talk to me or talk to people, way above me. And I think that it can be very daunting to get advice for somebody who's already at maybe what you would consider the pinnacle of there. So it's probably nice to talk to lots of different areas and have just a real understanding of, do I want to get into this? What are the real challenges? And chances are, if you talk to enough of those people, that's going to be your entry point. I think that there's no great way, there's no magic bullet to get your entry point. It's very hard. That's the number one thing. It's hard to get into healthcare sales, right? There's people that, and I feel pretty well connected, that send me notes on being able to do that. And then I would say, of those people that send me notes to follow up, to pick my brain, about I really feel like less than 20% of people then actually follow through and connect there, right? So you have to be intentional, but you also have to be kind of persistent, and you have to take action, right? So I think that that's number one on the networking piece. Talk to folks, talk to various different level folks, but if people make time for you, make sure and actually do it. And then the other advice that I give to folks is, be kind of intellectually curious. And there's a lot of creative ways to either get your foot in the door. And what I would not suggest is, and it's okay if people did it, but there's so much learning now that's, I would say, on demand. Is if you really want to get into it and understand, HubSpot, sales, all of the tools that we talked about right there, like there's enough knowledge now that probably didn't exist, I would say even 5 years ago, just around sales to make yourself a viable candidate of knowing what you're talking about. I think that you're still going to be able to learn and iterate, but it's not really an excuse now to be like, okay, I want to get into software sales. What's Salesforce, right? Like, even if you come from outside the industry, you come from teaching, like you have to know some of these foundational areas. And then I think that, from a digital health and healthcare sales is like, what do you want to sell? So my advice is narrow down an industry, a type of sale, or type of, organization, and then just have a short list and be able to leverage, just be able to say, hey, I want to do software sales for a big company, or I want to do software sales for a startup. And then just kind of, go and have as many conversations as you have, interview for as many of those companies, do creative things. Like one of the, I guess, best examples that I've seen here recently is how someone leveraged video within their interview and sales process to differentiate themselves to break in, right? They came from teaching, and they used a platform like Vidyard or Loom from an actionability perspective, and it got them an interview by just sending doing their research, knowing who the hiring manager was, sending them a personalized video to get in the door, and then also using video to be able to help give them an understanding of that sales process. And to me, when I'm hiring folks, that is particularly for a startup, that's way much. I'd rather see someone do that because it's going to be creative on getting in the door to some of those health system folks. It's authentic. It wasn't disingenuous. And then also too, to me, that is something that fundamentally somebody from, Bain, McKinsey, a big consulting firm, like wouldn't do. And so if I'm looking at 2 resumes, there's probably some people that say, oh, they have this amazing consulting experience. Maybe I've been in startups, too long. If you want to get in startups, I'd take candidate B that does some of those creative ways, because I think that that's gonna, selfishly be able to help me in the company there. So networking and intellectually, curiosity, I think are the 2 main advice I'd give for folks. And then number 3 is, do you really want to get into healthcare? But I recommend it, right? I recommend it.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's been awesome talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Igor. It's great to hear about your story. And, again, if folks want to connect with me, especially any of the folks that listen to your podcast, definitely make the time for them and hopefully help out. If not, just learn a little bit about them and their journey.
Josh, a huge thank you for sharing your extensive experience and shedding light on the symbiotic relationship between sales and healthcare. Your passion and dedication to driving technological solutions that cater to real-world challenges are nothing short of inspiring. We're grateful for the wisdom you've shared today. This episode of the Health Tech Crew is made possible by Kepler Team, where we pride ourselves on crafting top-tier software solutions tailored for health tech innovators. Stay tuned for more riveting discussions on the future of healthcare technology. Until the next time.